thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Bartholomew Bland. I'm the executive director of the Lehman College Art Gallery, dedicated to humanities across the disciplines. And I'm really pleased that you are all here with us today. If you're joining, I'd ask that you please turn off your video at this time. I'd appreciate that, so that we can give our full attention to our speaker. But then at the end of her talk, I'm sure she will entertain your questions. We are very lucky to be joined today by Professor Eure in our English department at Lehman College. And she's going to be presenting the first of a series of talks that are being held at the gallery to celebrate Black History Month. And in today's lecture, Professor Eure will be discussing Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative, the first book-length fugitive slave narrative to be published by a Black woman in the United States. Focusing on the means by which Jacobs navigates the legal and social enclosures of slavery, Professor Eure will explore how Jacobs' text opens possibilities for rethinking notions of kinship, kinlessness, and Black fugitivity. And so I very much welcome Professor Eure today, and I'm going to give you a little bit of her biography. This is her second semester at Lehman College, and we're thrilled to have her here. She received her PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania and her BA in Portuguese and Brazilian Studies from Smith College. She specializes in 19th century African-American literature, with a focus on intermeshed histories of Black and Indigenous people and the visual culture of race and kinship. Her current research project, The Grammar of Kinship, Black and Native Intimacies in the 19th Century, explores the literary and legal effacement of Black and Native bonds and the new forms of kin-making and literary production that accompanied that effacement. She has presented work from the project at the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, the American Studies Association, and the Critical and Ethnic Studies Association. And so without further ado, I will turn today's talk over to Professor Eure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I know my students are here for my AFM class. And so I want to address you guys. So please ask questions. I know that you're beginning to read Harriet Jacobs's work. But I really invite you into this space to ask questions. And I'm glad that you all came and I can see you in the chat. Okay, so I'm speaking to you from my apartment in Brooklyn, which is located on the traditional and unceded homelands of the Lenape peoples, a territory that encompasses a unity of relations with the land and the water and the plants and the animals and the peoples that still protect these territories. I'm speaking to you on lands where my ancestors were forced to labor as stolen people on stolen lands in indigenous nations in the southern part of the US, and as an assistant professor in the English department at Lehman College, an institution that sits on the same stolen lands that I share this work with you today. So my talk, Collective Black Fugitive Practices and Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is part of a larger project that examines the intermeshed histories of Black and Indigenous peoples in communities in the 19th century, in 19th century US literature and law. Part of what I'm trying to do in this project is to challenge the frameworks that erase these histories, not in an effort to just uncover a better account of 19th century US settler society, but to use what might be called impossible relations and intimacies to glimpse shared notions of belonging that are at once at odds with, with settler law and governance defined by citizenship and normative kinship. So my reading of Jacobs's text is really trying to uncover elusive traces of lived efforts, desires, distinct political subjectivities to evade those settler-imposed terms of belonging. While my talk will focus on Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl, I will also discuss resonances between Jacobs's text and Canadian Mohawk writer E. Pauline Johnson and her short story, A Red Girl's Reasoning, which was published later in the 19th century in 1893. So Johnson was the daughter of a Mohawk chief and cousin to American writer William Dean Howell. She is probably most well known for her performance poetry that combined imagery of racial amalgamation, conquest, indigeneity, and settler colonial violence. I include Johnson's work in a talk on Harriet Jacobs in order to draw out at least one convergence in how we might begin to think about intermeshed histories of Black and Indigenous peoples around concepts of legal kinship and norms of settler marriage. So I'll begin by talking about Jacobs's work and then explore resonances between Jacobs and Johnson. I do so not to argue for an equivalence of positions between enslaved and free Black peoples and Indigenous peoples, but because Harriet Jacobs and E. Pauline Johnson have a particularly illuminating way of disclosing efforts to exceed the legal and social enclosures of 19th century settler governance. Harriet Jacobs published Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1861 under the pseudonym Linda Brent, with the editorial assistance of her daughter, Louisa, who recopied the manuscript and standardized the spelling and punctuation before Lydia Marie Child became editor as a precondition of the novel's publication. Before the narrative was eventually published, however, Jacobs had to purchase and self-publish the book as the publishing firm went out of business. Though Jacobs notes in the novel's introduction that she intended for the novel to arouse the women of the North to a realizing sense of the condition of 2 million women in the South, still in bondage, suffering what I suffered, and most of them far worse, I want to add my testimony to that of abler pens to convince the people of the free states what slavery really is. Jacobs directs her text to multiple audiences. The narrative itself makes explicit its critique of Northern white women's complicity in the maintenance and cruel treatment of generations of Black women. As African-American literary and cultural critic Hazel Carby notes, Linda Brent did not recount the actions of her mistress as if they were only an individual instance of betrayal, but placed them within a history of acts of betrayal toward 3 generations of women in her family: herself, her mother, and her grandmother. Jacobs's narrative is an intergenerational family history that also embeds the accounts of enslaved and free Black communities surrounding her. It is also a narrative that forces us to center the experiences of enslaved Black women that conceived of their oral family histories as expressive constructions of continuity that function to document for a reading public a continuity of experience already constructed and preserved within her family through oral accounts. Jacobs explains the plight of Black enslaved mothers who do not have legal rights to their children by incorporating their experiences into her own critique of the institutionalized negation of Black motherhood. In telling her grandmother that in order to escape the sexual persecution of her slave master, Dr. Flint, she consents to sexual relations with Mr. Sands, a white lawyer, and is pregnant, Jacob first situates the keen insights of slave mothers like her grandmother into her account. Jacobs writes, "I think she saw something unusual was the matter with me. The mother of slaves is very watchful. She knows there is no security for her children. And if they have entered their teens, she lives in daily expectation of trouble." Jacobs's description of the Black slave mother's unrelenting dread of sexual violence awaiting her children recalls Hortense Spiller's articulation of kinship in her seminal essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American Grammar Book. To provide context, in this essay, Spiller outlines how transatlantic slavery's use of the reproductive capacities of the African female captive and the African American female captive altered kinship structures and the very meaning of kinship for generations. For Spillers, the relation between mother and child is disfigured under these conditions, precisely because parta sequitur ventrum legally dictated that any child born to an enslaved mother, to an enslaved woman, was born into slavery. Thus, kinship loses meaning since it can be invaded at any given and arbitrary moment by the kinship relations, and that's Spiller speaking. It is this wounded kinship that severs the Black captive's relation to family. Although Spillers recognizes forms of what she calls family and support structures among the enslaved, and a will to survive that startles the imagination, it is the dominant racial order that Spillers argues has primacy over any human and social claim. And in that political order of things, kin, just as gender formation, has no decisive legal or social efficacy, and that's Spillers again. The devaluation of Black female reproduction is what Spillers describes as an emptying out of the relation between mother and child, and the forging of the link between family and property. And she proposes that the perpetuation of US slavery depended on the destructive loss of the natural mother. So I argue that Jacobs is attempting to rework this denial of motherhood and mothering by engaging in sexual relations in order to turn the possession of her womb under parta sequitur ventrum into a site of imagining the potential of escape and freedom. In other words, Jacobs's sexual relations with Mr. Sands enables the subversion of parta sequitur ventrum, even as the children born to them reinscribe the law. So Jacobs describes the terms of this relation as a deliberate calculation, a strategy devised to prevent her rape by her master and the sale into slavery of the children born from this sexual violation. Witnessing other enslaved women separated from their children and sold informs her decision. As Jacobs explains, I shudder to think of being the mother of children that should be owned by my old tyrant. I know that as soon as a new fancy took him, his victims were sold off to get rid of them, especially if they had children. I'd seen several women sold with his babies at the breast. The deliberate calculation that Jacobs is forced to devise is tethered to the potential children she will birth and the decision to have children with someone that does not own her. Jacobs asserts, of a man who was not my master, I could ask to have my children well supported. And in this case, I felt confident I should obtain the boon. I also felt quite sure that they would be made free. The strategy to subvert the possession of her womb anchors Jacobs' critique of the denial of motherhood and mothering, and also operates to underline the options available to enslaved women. Under slavery, the concept of motherhood was crucial to sustaining the racial logics that translated Black women's reproductive capacities into a site for the reproduction of property. As Saidiya Hartman notes, the maternal function was not enshrined with minimal or restricted rights, but indistinguishable from the condition of enslavement and its reproduction. This structural negation of Black motherhood and mothering relied upon the dispossession of enslaved people's familial and affective attachments. Jacobs characterizes this condition as a theft of Black women's capacity to birth, mother, and care for their children under slavery. Within this context, Jacobs' strategy to transform the terms of this theft offers a radical challenge to US law. The conflation and naturalization of servitude and Blackness, and the legal codification of racial inheritance through the bodies of Black enslaved women in the 19th century remade kinship and intimacy in ways that inform the distinct political future projects of Black and Indigenous people. As Jennifer Morgan puts it, when racial slavery depended on the transformation of lineage into embodied inheritance, Black women could not be allowed to produce kinship. The production of Black kinlessness, as Morgan argues, was facilitated by situating women's reproductive possibilities firmly outside of private life, by rendering childbearing as an activity made manifest in the marketplace, and by codifying speculations regarding African women's failure to feel childbirth into legislative interventions that structurally denied African people the place of family. In narrating her desire to save her children by pointing to the racialized and gender dimensions of slavery, Jacobs explicitly traces a history of collective refusal to the forced terms of familial life by linking Black maternal desire to a concept of Black survival. In Domestic Allegories of Political Desire, literary critic Claudia Tate proposes that Harriet Jacobs's text relied on the politicalization of Black motherhood to critique the domestic defilement of Black homes. As Tate notes, Jacobs's desire to free her children from slavery was inextricably linked to the text's formulation of freedom. In Tate's assessment of Jacobs's narrative strategy, Black maternal desire functioned to structure its political argument of institutional inaction to the persistent violation of Black womanhood, maternity, family, and home. Returning to Spiller's meditation on the Black mother as a route by which the dominant modes decided the distinction between humanity and the other, in the context of Jacobs's novel, forces us to think about how Jacobs created and navigated this reinscription of motherhood as a mode of Black survivance. Jacobs's narrative is a testimony of the collective experiences of Black fugitive practices that situates the law and political institutions as responsible for the perpetuation of the racial and sexual violation of Black women under slavery. So I want to pivot to one scene of convergence between Jacobs and Canadian writer E. Pauline Johnson to show how resonances between their works in terms of how each author narrates legal and social, as a way to show how each author narrates legal and social enclosures. So in Johnson's short story, A Red Girl's Reasoning, she describes how the domestication of Native land and Native bodies operated through settler-sanctioned white Native marriages. So the story begins with the protagonist, Christy's father, so the story begins with the protagonist, Christy, a Native woman who is about to marry Charlie McDonald. So Charlie and Jimmy Robinson, Christy's father, exchange stories about their experiences interacting with Native peoples in the moments before the marriage. So in this opening scene, Robinson instructs Charlie on how to restrain the natural impulses of Native people, warning him to be pretty good to her or she'll balk sure as shooting. After Charlie establishes that he is prepared to marry a woman despite being a town boy, Charlie explains that he gets on with them too. And that as a boy, he had the Indian relic hunting craze. As a youth, he had studied Indian archaeology and folklore. And as a man, he consummated his predilections for Indianology by loving, winning, and marrying the quiet little daughter of the English trader, who himself had married a Native woman 20 years ago. So the narrator's description outlines how white settlers in Canada, and we might even say the US, developed relationships with Native women and gained access to Native land, which is embodied in Charlie's occupation in the story as a census taker and land surveyor. So following the marriage, Christy and Charlie moved to the city, and at a dance at the lieutenant governor's house, Christy reveals her parents were married by Indian rights. So Charlie is ashamed, and Christy rebukes her husband for refusing to recognize Native marriage rights as actually binding. Christy tells Charlie, "You have studied my race and their laws for years. Do you mean to tell me that because there was no priest and no magistrate, my mother was not married? Do you mean to say that all my forefathers for hundreds of years back have been illegally born? If so, you blacken my ancestry beyond all reason." In other words, if what he believes were true, it would blacken her ancestry. So that is, reduce her family's kinship bonds to nothing but illicit concubinage and biological descent. I read this moment in the story where Christy raises and rejects the kinship, and rejects the kinlessness that would be imposed by the state were she to succumb to the norms of settler marriage and kinship in relation to Jacobs's reworking of legal kinship. In Canada, where Johnson primarily wrote and lived, though she's really understood as like this transnational figure who also was a performance poet. She had traveled to Europe, other parts of Canada, North America, and I even want to say she had like trips to Latin America. And so she's really a kind of transnational figure, both in her ancestry and also in her like geographic kind of spatial kind of literary production. So in Canada, where Johnson primarily wrote and lived, the Indian Act of 1876 helped to secure both the Canadian nation state in 1867 and the dispossession of Indigenous women from their land and tribe by instituting heteropatriarchal and heteronormative marriage laws that dissolved Indigenous women's Aboriginal status when they married white men. So what this meant was that without Indian status and the band membership that goes along with it, Native people are not allowed to live in any part of an Indian reserve in Canada, unless it is leased to them as an outsider. So Christy nullifies her own marriage by leaving her husband and establishing herself in another town off the reserve, in effect claiming for herself the ability to undo the belonging that had been created by the state. So here I read, this possible convergence between Harriet Jacobs' revision of legal kinship and Johnson's refusal of settler marriage and kinship. So by juxtaposing Johnson and Jacobs' writings, I want to insist on reading their political projects within a Black Indigenous constellation of ongoing radical refusals and confrontations with settler colonial violence, racial slavery, and colonization that has had disparate meanings for and impact on Indigenous and Black people. In my discussion, my aim really has been to think not simply about how slavery and settler colonialism impacted the condition of possibility for how each author negotiated settler marriage and kinship, but also how they challenged the foundation of these institutions through mobilizing, in Johnson's case, her body, through mobilizing, in Jacobs' case, her body, and in Johnson's case, Native marriage rights. And I kind of fumbled there because both are in some way about spatial kind of bodily conquest, right? Like, so they're not necessarily distinct. When we're talking about marriage, we're also talking about a certain kind of like bodily conquest as well. And so they're kind of mobilizing these in opposition to Canadian and US laws. So despite the temporal and geographic disjuncture, in the publication of Jacobs and Johnson's work, each actively asserted a political subjectivity that the other might have only known through her own critique of the processes of racialized kinship, spatial domestic confinement, and marriage. In other words, Jacobs and Johnson were operating within long-lived practices and traditions of refusing the terms of land theft, of the dispossession of their bodies, of the negation of Black motherhood and familial ties, and of the political and cultural institutions. That is, what I want to emphasize are the structural and legal forces that Jacobs and Johnson sought to challenge, and the terms they refused to live by. For Jacobs, as Saidiya Hartman has suggested, the indifference to injury, the extended use and dispossession of the captive body, the negation of motherhood, and the failure and omissions of the law shaped her Texas political critique. As an enslaved Black mother living in fugitivity and in the possibility of movement towards freedom through communal and familial assistance, Jacobs also archives a multiplicity of desires that are shared and unrealized. As Jennifer Morgan reminds us, Indigenous women in English colonies did not escape racial slavery, but were central to the expansion of the plantation. As Morgan notes, Native American women too became part of the mathematics of mastery, so that by the turn of the 17th century, North Carolina settlers understood slave ownership in terms of both Black and brown bodies. While the enslavement of African and Native women was differently experienced in this period and would also be differently shaped by the incorporation of hereditary slavery in the 19th century, how Black and Indigenous women were forced to labor alongside each other is significant when we place this interconnection in a history of denied connection. By drawing together Harriet Jacobs and E. Pauline Johnson's work, I mean to intervene in this erasure and sketch a counter narrative of a history of entanglement. Thank you. So I'm open to questions, comments, both from my lovely students and from everyone else. And I imagine that I'm going to be facilitating this. So Claudio, I see your box, and so you can get to ask the first question.
Great. Good afternoon, Professor. My question is regarding the New Year's Day for the slave people. For what I read, children were sold on that day, and people had they had to be employed or they had to be sold to other owners in that day. So I was wondering how Jacobs was able to overcome that, and her grandmother. So,
like, how was she able to like not participate in that buying and selling?
I think that was really critical for the bonding between families and heritage, and so sort of like the way that they see themselves, because you can have heritage if you are sold as a child to somebody else.
And so yeah, and so partly what I'm trying to have us think about in exploring Jacobs's work is to not necessarily move away from the slave market, but to have us think more, to kind of center not the market, but the relations, the kinship relations, both like fictive, right, that existed despite the slave market, despite the fact that family members were sold. And so kind of to really center and imagine and to use archival material and to kind of think about and mine Jacobs's text as a kind of archive, right? Like, so in that text that you read the first 4 chapters of, we have voices of enslaved women. And that book there's so many women in that text. that we can actually mine and use as a kind of archive to give us a sense of not simply Black women, Black enslaved women participating in like white settler like constructions of like Happy New Year celebrations, but like, you know, like the desires and the sentiment that it felt like to be a part of such a presentation, to watch it, to understand like what maybe preceded it. And so I think it produces a different kind of narrative when we're focused and paying attention to like the possible articulations of enslaved people, and like to really kind of to search that text for the existence of those. Because I think if we have a different orientation that is not necessarily situated, like Black people knew about the slave market. It's not, I mean, and we have like so many accounts of that and so many narratives of that. And so I want to think about like how Black people actually form communities, despite the fact that Harriet Jacobs was living in a space of enclosure, that like ideas and dreams of freedom, it didn't extinguish those, but those were active and alive. And it was a part of the way that Black people survived. And so I'm interested in looking and tracing that and beginning there as a point of like thinking about not necessarily the slave market, but like how Black enslaved women like practice freedom. And that practice of freedom is through fictive kinships, through kinships and marriages that like that trouble the notion of the state's understanding of marriage, the state's understanding of what constitutes a family, what constitutes freedom, what constitutes desire.
Yeah, what I'm arguing is because of the significance of New Year's, it was supposed to be happy and in itself, but it's a critical moment for the slave and also for her to build a family afterwards, that she survived the circumstances. So
yeah, and I would say
it's amazing. It's amazing.
It is, and I would say like we need to also think about like critical for whom, right? Like, I mean, that's, you know, New Year's. So I think you're right to like, I think I would spend some time with that moment and really think about like, how is it being narrated? Who's narrating it? And what other, like in their moments, there's like a multiplicity. And I think that's something I want to like really emphasize, that it's not like a singular thing, right? It's like a multiplicity, it's a collective. So this text doesn't in some sense even belong to Jacobs. It belongs to like a collective, like community of Black enslaved women. So I see, does anyone have any other questions? I don't know how to navigate. Okay.
Yes,
How are you?
I'm fine. I wanted to touch on what you had discussed about the Black woman's body and how it was looked at as if Black women couldn't feel during childbirth, and that basically their bodies, which were and still to this day are being like objectified.
Yeah.
And it just reminded me during the reading that we had to do of several scenes. One scene was on page 24 with the couple, the slave couple they were bickering.
Yeah.
And I believe the man said to the woman that the trader said to the woman that she was not supposed to broadcast who had gotten her pregnant.
Yeah.
Because I guess her spouse found out it was the slave master. And also there was another scene when the young woman was dying and the mistress was watching her die. And it was just, she was so cold towards her and laughing and saying, you know, you would never make it to heaven, just to see how the Black woman's body is just like, was used literally as like chattel, like literally. And how she touches on that through the different voices, I feel like is great. But I'm just interested in like seeing a woman who like would go through that already like go through a difficult childbirth. And I know we haven't gotten too far to see somebody who went through that and actually survived, and
I
how.
know. Yeah. I mean, like, I know I have us reading like in stages. And for me, like, you'll get that with Harriet Jacobs. And I'm like glad, since I know you're working on a novel that kind of really wants to imagine not necessarily like a positive ending, but like really thinking about this concept of like Black survivance. Like how does a Black woman survive that? And so like moving beyond like maybe the market, or like scenes of like preparing Black subjects for the market, and that like narrative that I feel like in some ways is like repetitive. Like we've heard that story over and over again, and there's a way that like what you're saying is like there's something about this language, even this treatment, that feels like, why does this feel relevant today? Like we're talking about like Black pain. And so as you read Jacobs, like I think it in some ways it's going to do that for you as you keep reading forward.
Okay. Thank you.
So I can see people, I'm not on a view where I can see. So I'm going to do a full screen.
Hi, Professor Eure. It's Deborah. I'm just going to tell you who's, I'm going to help facilitate the questions for you.
Thank you.
Just by feeding them to you. Caleb Acosta has a question.
Hey, Caleb.
Yes, I want to comment on one of the points you made about the novel, talking about how these cis hetero sort of norms were enforced on the slaves during their captivity. And I was thinking about the other day, I was researching, and it's illuminating how pre-colonialization, there was no real gender, there was no real customs or laws that regulated gender expression, gender identity, same-sex relationships, things of that sort. We see how a lot of these norms that still exist today in our own communities were enforced by those colonizers and those slave masters who brought in their Christian customs to pretty much erase African spirituality and African customs that in certain ways encouraged gender expression and encouraged things like that. So I thought that was really illuminating.
Yeah, and I'm glad you picked up on that. It's something I'm really interested in thinking about, and really center my work on thinking about like different constructions of, or refusals to conform to like heteronormative family structures or relationality. And that what a lot of the work that I'm looking at, including E. Pauline Johnson and Harriet Jacobs, is doing is in some ways, like kind of refusing the terms of like settler understandings of like domesticity and home. And you know, with the caveat, there's a degree to which they in some ways are reinforcing it, and we'll sort of, as we read Jacobs in the class, we'll sort of think a little bit about that. But I'm really interested in like these kind of sites of refusal, and kind of thinking about kinship and intimacy and fictive kinship as a site to kind of think about how like heteronormative, heteropatriarchal family formations are actually being unsettled in ways in a lot of 19th century literature that I kind of take up in this project. And I like that. Please raise your electric hand.
And we have Trayvon Riddy Porter.
Yeah, hi. So I just want to say, like, this was my second time reading this story with, my bad, I keep forgetting.
You didn't say that in class. You didn't actually admit that you had read it. So like, this is actually nice to hear your second time.
So yeah, but it's like, it's just like so interesting to able to see like this cruelty that slaves had to go through, just trying to survive, like basically how she had to have sex with this man just so her master couldn't use her body, so she can have even the small amount of control over her body. So she had to outthink him, use her wits, I don't know, it's like it shows like all these slave women try to use their wits and their whatever they had to be able to get ahead, like with the grandmother who over time, because she was so old, she had all these skills and people came to her so she wouldn't be mistreated as much. So I just thought that was a like interesting to see during the story.
Yeah, and I think like partly what I hear you saying too is like centering Black women's experiences
Yeah.
under slavery, and also like you're talking about like a grandmother who becomes like a focal point
Yeah.
for other enslaved women, and also like a source of knowledge, a kind of elder, a source of knowledge for how to kind of navigate both the conditions of slavery, but also even as a site for to imagine freedom. And like then thinking about like, you know, it forces us to think about like reconstituting glimpses, like notions of freedom through like, you know, I don't know, like having a conversation, like many moments in Jacob's text, like where she's sitting with her grandmother. Like, could we imagine that even that moment as glimpsing something close to freedom or some like, so then it forces us to think about and really put pressure on concepts, these big concepts of like freedom and even survival, like how we constitute and understand them. And it's nice that you're reading Jacob's twice, because it's a very difficult text, you know.
Yeah. With all the scenes of just like this plain cruelty for no reason. That's
Yeah.
Especially with the mistress spitting in the food, so her slaves or the cooks and the everyone who assisted couldn't eat unless she gave like stuff like that. Just like so they taking away the shoes, so she had to walk in snow. So it's like
yeah, and it's like, what do you do with all those like scenes of cruelty? Like, and and like we can think about this in this moment, like, and kind of Sadie was talking about like the concept that like Black women don't feel pain or Black people don't feel pain. And so I think like, you know, it's a question of like what, like even as you're reading this text, like what do you do with all those scenes of cruelty? Like how do we even understand that today? And like how do we not like remain there, right? Like, and so it's kind of okay, the scenes of cruelty are a narrative device in some ways, because she is constructing a novel for us to kind of think about forms of freedom. So it's like, it's also important that like we don't, it's easy to remain, you know, because they're so quotidian, right? They're so everyday. And they might like link up to like forms of cruel, and the use of the word cruelty is like really important. Like, how do you even understand this? And so like, I mean, in our class, we're going to think about like, you know, how this is kind of reconstituted in our everyday. And I can just keep talking to you, so I'm gonna zip it. You already know this.
All right, thank you.
Jason Moy has a question.
Hey, Jason. I love that my students are asking questions.
Hi, my name is Jason. I'm actually from I believe it's the art history, not art history, but like, I think it's the art history class.
So you aren't my student.
Yeah.
I have another student named Jason. Okay, ask away.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure that Jacobs, is that correct? Is that correct? She covers on with like slavery, gives the viewpoints of African Americans in slavery, and women and women's body image in that it was endured during slavery. If I'm trying to make that make sense, and how like, you know, the land has pretty much been taken away from indigenous people. Like, I'm trying to figure out how, you know, how can we, like, I'm trying to figure out how will we basically try to like understand and try to change the stat for like for a better outcome. Like, for example, like, you know, giving back to people their land, or give an understanding of their viewpoints back then.
And I think okay, so so you raise a number of what might seem like competing ideas, but like, so I would say less, like I want to put a little pressure on the idea of like what Jacobs is doing is talking about body image, because this is an account that is not necessarily interested in, like, I would not use the language of body image.
Yeah.
And I think if we're talking about body, and I know I sort of talked about body as like spatial bodily conquest, and was really trying to think about that in terms of like indigeneity and indigenous land. And I think like partly it's important to kind of at once like pull those apart and then see where you find some convergence. And so I think like when we're thinking about Jacobs and we're thinking about how she articulates and narrates like her body, she's doing this within like questions and concepts of like Black reproduction, and in relation to like the law. So what, like women's lack of control or women's control over their bodies or women's, and so like she's kind of reworking legal structures that deny Black women control over their bodies. And so it's a different thing than like she's looking in the mirror and she's like, oh, I look good. Like it's not a body image, right? So she's not doing that. And we also have to think about like, she's operating in the 19th century, she's an enslaved woman, like she has no right, she belongs to her slave master. And so like the questions that we pose in this moment are radically different than, let's say, a white woman who's free, or a free enslaved woman who can be looking in the mirror and say like, I look really good. And so can Jacobs, right? But when we're thinking also about, okay, so Indigenous, Native women, the example I used was Canada, and kind of thinking about like Indigenous women's like relationship to land and marriage and place. I think it's important to like begin to kind of think about that in its own terms before we just like smack them together, right? And so the way that like family and kinship functioned and marriage functioned for Indigenous women in the 19th century is different. That like kind of genealogy and that history and that relation to the settler state and to racialization it's a different history. And so I think when we're studying like Black and Indigenous people, we don't want to just conflate them. And so what I'm trying to do, and I think what's really important, is to kind of think about, okay, where do we see places of entanglement, and where do they come together, and where do we see? And so what I try to do is kind of think about, I see this entanglement in terms of like kinship, in terms of like Canadian and even US laws around family and around intimacy. And so this is how I see, and in the contemporary moment, we can see this around state violence, the disappearance of like Indigenous women and Black women. And so there's the convergences in the contemporary moment might be a little bit more clear, and also the movements might be a little bit more clear in articulating some like constellation. But I think it's in some ways a little harder in the 19th century, which is probably why I like studying it. But I think there's something happening in terms of like kinship and intimacy. But we also have to remember that many Black people were enslaved by Indigenous people in the southern part of the United States. So by nations, like 5 nations in the South that were relocated to Oklahoma. And so many people of African descent are also of Indigenous descent. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking about like intersections and convergences.
Yeah, I just kind of wondered because, like, I'm trying to get a better understanding with what's going on with today, especially with like, it's kind of like the question is, it's like, are we truly free from, from after years of slavery and oppression? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'm going to put, so Tiffany King has this new work called The Black Shoals. It's really taking up the questions, and I'm putting the name in the chat. It's really taking up the questions that you're talking about. So it gives you a frame to kind of think about both like Native Indigenous histories of genocide, colonization, but resurgence, and also kind of in the contemporary moment, like both taking us through a kind of longer history, but also like Black and like sort of Black articulations of freedom, and kind of tracing that both, like, I think she begins in the 19th century and takes us to the present. And so she gives us a way to do that. And the last chapter might be of interest to you because it deals with visual culture and an artist actually who's kind of thinking between Black and Native studies.
Hello, Professor Eure. Olivia Moy has a question.
Hey, Olivia.
Olivia, unmute yourself.
Oh, hi, Eve. Thanks so much for this talk, first of all, which was so interesting. From the title, I knew you were going to talk about Harriet Jacobs, but the E. Pauline Jacobs was Johnson was such a treat. And there's been a lot of renewed interest in E. Pauline Johnson, especially in my field, Victorian studies. So I wanted to ask you a methodological question, because one really neat thing you do is you take different moments from two 19th century texts, and you just now spoke about how it's important to draw out these connections, but you do it in a very kind of respectful, tactful way, kind of paying attention to the difference and not conflating, as you said. So I'm sure you know that in the past year or so, especially in the field of British studies, there's been kind of a reawakening. So for me, that meant in the field of Romanticism, people were drawing a lot from Black studies. In Victorian, there's a lot of attention to Indigenous studies. So I was just wondering, as a scholar and for students also, do you have kind of suggestions or recommendations about how to do that tactfully, or pitfalls to avoid? I think a lot of scholars are sometimes hesitant to dip into a field that's not their own, but you seem to be doing it really well. So if you have any just suggestions or things to think about.
Yeah, and I think because the two fields are not just like different, like in terms of like scholarship, and also like the structure of like how it functions in a college or university, that the fields are actually in tension with each other. So around issues of slavery, settler colonialism, and who is considered a settler. And so I approach this, I don't know how to, I'm well read. Like, I don't know, like I have to, like, in order to kind of think about how to sort of think with Native Indigenous scholars and think with African American and Black diasporic scholars, I really have to be attentive to the kind of priorities of the discipline and the field. And so that comes in the form of like citational practices, that comes in the form of, I began with a land acknowledgement. And I generally, I think in talks in the past I have not done that, but I also wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement that wasn't just like a pat land acknowledgement. And so what I tried to do is I tried to kind of braid my own experience in that. And so it's, in some ways, I think it's like really being attentive to the tensions, the larger debates that are contained within these two disciplines. And also just, I think like not collapsing the kind of historical violence that Black and Indigenous people have experienced, that really understanding like these as like distinct like historical, political, racial, cultural formations that have its own history, own genealogies, and really just being attentive to that, but also citing. Like, I think the citational practice is like really crucial to like building. And I think for me, and I don't know like what's happening in British studies, like, but for me, I think that's like one of the most crucial things that's like, I think not happening, but also gets talked about in a lot of like conferences and journals and informal and formal conversations, is the lack of like conversation and citational practices. And that is translated into a kind of misunderstanding about either like the priorities of Black and Indigenous scholars in this moment and the priorities of Black African American and Black diasporic writers. And so it's just like also listening, can't like really kind of listening. And these two fields require a different kind of academic listening and writing that I don't always think is commensurate with the academy. And so there's a lot of also personal writing that needs to get included in this work. A lot of like, yeah, and I hope I answered I kind of roundabout answered your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Eure. That was a wonderful presentation. We really appreciated it. And I wanted to come back and make a plug for our next speaker in the series. That's Professor Augustus Durham, also from the English department, who will be speaking on Tuesday, February 16th at the same time at 2 o'clock. And he'll be speaking on the 9 Lives of Frederick Douglass, which will be a very interesting presentation. And then I know, Professor Eure, you're going to come back and be in conversation with Professor Durham on Wednesday, February 24th. That will be in the evening, where you're going to be having a dialogue about Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass and social movements today, to sort of reflect on today. So we have a lot to look forward to.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for my class for asking really, really great questions, and for reading and for engaging, and for everyone else who asked. And thank you, Olivia, for that question as well. And thank you for inviting me. This has been really nice. And I'm looking forward to like more collaborations with the art gallery. And I know there's like tremendous interest in the English department. So I'm really happy about that.
Well, we're really excited about that. And for students who are listening, if you want to see this recording, it will be up in the next couple of days on the gallery's YouTube channel. You could just Google, search Lehman College Art Gallery to find Professor Eure's talk. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.